as similar as people are around the world, as similar as humans are around the world, there are differences between one group of people and another group of people. There are differences. We have found genes that are different, and we're going to talk about some of them right now. Researchers around the world have attempted to identify different genetic variables that might lead to social sensitivity. So we were trying to figure out why in the world are the Japanese the way they are. Japanese were the most vicious monsters you could possibly imagine, butchering people, well, I think I've told you that the first 2 years of the war, we hardly captured anybody. We hardly captured any Japanese soldiers. They wouldn't surrender, so we just killed them. We wouldn't take them as prisoners, and they didn't take us as prisoners. They just killed us. That's pretty brutal if you think about it. So we didn't capture hardly anybody, despite the fact that there were Japanese people living in Hawaii, there were Japanese people living in the United States. Of course, we took most of those people, the ones living in the United States, and we put them in concentration camps because we were afraid that they were fifth columnists, that they would sabotage. They would go into factories and sabotage the factories. So we threw them in concentration camps, and we had no problem with them at all. The people in Hawaii, they didn't do anything with the Japanese people of Japanese descent in Hawaii, and we had no problem with them at all. Yet while we were fighting the Japanese, things like the Banzai attack occurred, kamikaze attacks occurred, where they would rather die and kill us than live. It was just very, very confusing. Nobody could quite figure out what was going on. So we're fighting this horrible, god-awful war with the Japanese, where everybody's butchering everybody else. We dropped the bomb on them. We wouldn't have dropped the bomb on Germany just to win the war, but we did Japan. We were willing not only to drop the bomb, but then the second bomb. We didn't need to drop the second bomb. The second bomb was experimental. We weren't even sure it would work. Of course, we weren't sure the first bomb would work, but we knew after we dropped the first bomb that it worked. We didn't need to drop the second bomb on Nagasaki. But we did it anyway, because we were pissed. Really pissed off at the Japanese. It was a brutal, brutal, monstrous war. And if you've ever seen the movie Letters from Our Fathers about the Battle of Iwo Jima, the Japanese would rather commit suicide than allow themselves to be captured. It was god-awful, beyond anything you can possibly imagine. We've never fought an enemy that was like that before. Yet, after we dropped the two bombs on Japan, they were ready to fight us. They were going to fight us with sharpened bamboo stakes. They were training children, small children, to attack us. And we knew that we were going to lose hundreds of thousands of men if we had to invade Japan. But the Japanese surrendered. The Japanese surrendered, and after the Japanese surrendered, we had absolutely no trouble with them at all. If you've ever been to Japan, they're the most polite people in the world. If you leave your billfold, if you forget your billfold and leave it on the bus, and it's got $1,000 in it, which is like 100,000 yen, it's going to be there the next day. That's how polite they are. That's how socially controlled they are. So we were trying to figure out, well, Americans are just like all over the place. We're happy people, we're really pleasant, people like us overseas. We try to make friends with everybody. There's something going on with Americans. But Americans are like mixed up from everybody and their cousin has gotten together to make Americans. Everybody likes American GIs, well, except the Japanese, but they like American GIs because we spend a lot of money and we're real friendly people. We tend to be really friendly people. But the Japanese are different. They're friendly too, but they're more socially sensitive than we are. They want everything to be the same way. There's a saying in Japan that the nail that sticks up, the person that's different in Japan gets hammered down so that he's the same as everybody else. And you think, well, that's just something that people say. No, it's not. It's the way it is over there. If you're different in Japan, you have to leave. They won't let you stay. They will drive you away. People will come up to you and ask you why, what's wrong with you, because you're different. Now, that would never happen in the United States. I mean, I'm dressed differently right now when you guys aren't asking me what's wrong with myself. Well, what's wrong with me? And you're very polite, and I appreciate that. Obviously, there's something wrong with me, too, but we won't go into that. Okay, so what they were looking for these socially sensitive alleles. And what they discovered was that the Japanese had, they found these that weren't found in the European samples. They found these three alleles, 5-HTT-LPR, A118G, and MAOA. MAOA stands for monoamine oxidase A. Monoamine oxidase A. Monoamine oxidase is a substance that if it is there in too high an amount, that it will cause depression. It causes depression. So what we, in the old days, we used to treat people with monoamine oxidase inhibitors. And there are still some out on the market. And we do treat people with monoamine oxidase inhibitors from time to time. And when we do that, it makes people less depressed. Okay. So what we've discovered is that they have a different type of MAO. They have MAOA, and we don't have MAOA. We have MAO. We don't have the A. It's a different type of allele. So they discovered that the Asians have this, but the Europeans didn't. And the question was, does it have something to do with social sensitivity? Why are they more socially sensitive than we are? We as people from the United States. A genetic variant that is associated with increased emotional support seeking in times of distress for European Americans is associated with decreased emotional support seeking among Koreans. So the same allele, the same genetic structure in European Americans leads to the opposite effect in Korea. So when we're under stress, when we're in distress, European Americans will seek assistance, and the same genetic structure, it forces them not to seek assistance in Korea, as confusing as all that is. I know, same genetic structure. What we're going to find out is we've done a lot of research with the Koreans, the European Americans and Koreans. A variant that is associated with increased attention to foreground objects among European Americans shows the opposite effect among Koreans. So once again, we see exactly the same genetic structure. In European Americans, it makes you focus on things in front of you, and in Koreans, it makes you look at things far away, as confusing as all that is. A variant that leads to better responses to antidepressants among Caucasians leads to worse responses among Koreans and Japanese. Now we know that this exists, and I can tell you that this exists because opiates don't work on me, okay? Caffeine doesn't affect me. What else doesn't work? Ibuprofen makes me depressed. Does ibuprofen make anybody else depressed? Are you guys okay with ibuprofen? You take it all the time? You don't start crawling around on your belly like a snake? You're so depressed. And the world turns gray when you take ibuprofen? No? Okay. So obviously there's biochemical differences between some people, one group of people and another group of people. 5% of the people in the world who take ibuprofen get depressed when they take it. 5%. And I'm one of those 5%. Well, that's kind of sad. I don't have any painkillers to take. So here we see that antidepressants that work on Caucasians, the same genetic structure among Koreans and Japanese doesn't work on them. And this is one of the reasons Prozac has had a very tainted past. When we first developed Prozac, they said it was 90% effective. And so everybody's going, oh good, we've got a new antidepressant, it doesn't cause it doesn't have any food allergies like tricyclics and monoamine oxidase inhibitors. This is great because now everybody can take Prozac. Well, it turned out that the next study said, well, it's about 75% effective. And then the next one said, well, it's just a little over half. And here we find that the Japanese and the Koreans can't take it at all. It doesn't work at all with the Japanese and the Koreans.
Is it because they have those alleles?
We don't know.
How do you say it?
Alleles?
Alleles.
Is it because they have different alleles than we do? I don't know. Why can't I take ibuprofen and you can't? That doesn't seem fair. Is it a male-female thing? Obviously not, because there are other males that can take ibuprofen, and I can't. I just can't take it. How many people? I mean, if I gave everybody, if I had a whole fistful of hydrocodone and I gave it to everybody, you guys would all be feeling pretty damn good. I'm guessing, if you've ever taken any opiates or opioids. Probably you'd feel pretty good. If I took it, nothing. I get nothing. No, it's not fair. It's not fair at all. You guys get high and I get nothing.
Can you get drunk?
Next time I get some hydrocodone, I'll distribute them among the class. I tell doctors are so stupid that I almost said something else. They're so stupid because they keep giving me things I tell them doesn't work. They don't believe me. I must be a liar. Is it on my forehead? Does it say liar? Yeah, it's right across there. Variant associated with decreased emotion suppression among European Americans predicted increased emotional expression among Koreans. So here we get the opposite effect again. Oh man. So are we the very opposite of Koreans? Maybe. Studies that included, as it turns out, that's not the way it works. Studies that included a sample of Korean Americans who were genetically more similar to Koreans, but culturally more similar to European Americans, showed a pattern of results that were more similar to those of European Americans, demonstrating that cultural experiences can actually shape how genes are expressed in the body. Okay, so we've got these different genes, but sometimes they're expressed and sometimes they aren't expressed. It all depends on your culture. The Korean culture is very, very different from the American culture. We have fast food for one thing. What else do we have? They eat a lot of rice. They eat a lot of seafood that we really don't eat in the United States. So potentially the way that they're raised in a less controlled society, maybe that has something to do with the way that the genes are expressed. It all depends on where you grow up. So if we have a set of Navajo twins, and mom and dad, right after the twins are born, they decide to split up, and dad takes Charlie and mom takes John and Charlie. So dad takes off for Phoenix and mom stays on the reservation. So they're raised in different environments. One's raised in an urban environment, the other's raised in a rural environment. So 18 years later, we get the two of them together, and we check them out. Their DNA is almost identical. Not quite identical, but it's almost identical. However, Charlie acts one way, and John acts a totally different way. And when we look at his genetic structure, some of these genes have been expressed because he lives in a rural environment up in the mountains, and Charlie lives down in the valley in Phoenix in an urban environment where it's a hell of a lot hotter in Phoenix than it is up here in the mountains. So we see that different genes were expressed for each of these identical twins, despite the fact that they're almost exactly the same. Does all that make sense? Do you see why this is the way it works? Korean Americans, it's expressed differently because of the environment that they live in. So when you live in a select environment, that environment forces these alleles to either express themselves or not to express themselves. So we are what our environment is. We are also what our genes are. I mean, I can't be 6 feet tall. My parents fed me really well when I was growing up. And this is it. This is as tall as I'm going to get. I'm never going to be any taller. And even if I grew up in a different environment, I'd still only be 5'6" or 5'7". I'm actually 5'6" now, but I used to be 5'7" when I was so much taller. But I'm 70 years old. I have 2 brothers that are 5'10". That's not fair. How come they got to be 5'10" and I'm 5'6"? I've got another brother that's 5'6", and I have 2 brothers that are 5'10", and they're better looking than I am. Damn it! That's not fair. Why did I have to be the short, ugly one? Well, there's 2 of us, so there's 2 short, ugly ones. I have 2 brothers that everybody's madly in love with those guys. Never had that problem.
I thought there was a way you could like inject somatotropin into your niece. Like there's a time period where you can.
Well, I think I'm beyond
Yeah,
that.
you are. But I remember that. I remember learning that in high school, and I told my science teacher I wanted to do that, but I never did.
No, you never did. Well, human growth hormone. You could take human growth hormone. Of course, it's probably going to destroy you to some extent. It's going to make you taller than you're supposed to be, so your body can't handle. It's like taking steroids. You'll rip your muscles away from your bones. So you've got to be really careful about some of these magic potions that people inject human chorionic gonadotropin into your knees. That's so cool. Well, let's talk about the Dutch. If you want to find a tall basketball team, go to Holland. The average height of Dutch males is 6'1". That's about 3 inches taller than the average American person in the United States. We're only about 5'10", a little over 5'10". So what does that tell you about me? I'm 5'6". I'm 4 inches shorter than the average American male. So as you look around the room and you look at all the males in the room, you see that almost everybody's right around average or above average. So congratulations for being so damn tall. I'm not jealous even a little bit. Okay, maybe a little bit. In 1865, American men averaged 5'8", which was 3 inches taller than the average Dutch man at the time. So the average Dutch man was 5'5". That was in 1865 during the Civil War, right at the end of the Civil War. At the beginning, that's 150 years ago. And now the average height for the Dutch is 6'1". Now what is it about the Dutch that makes them so damn tall? And what was going on in 1865? This is the history of Holland that you need to understand now. So what was going on in 1865 that's not going on now, or what? I don't know. Why are they so much taller now than they were? What's going on? Inbreeding? That has to do with what we were talking about before, doesn't it? Okay. What was going on in 1865? It was a very bifurcated society. To the extent that if you had money, then you got to eat and do whatever you wanted. If you were poor, it was almost like you were not a slave, but you didn't get as good of food, okay? You didn't eat meat. You probably didn't have any dairy products that you could eat. You know, they eat a lot of cheese over in Holland. Why would you make your milk into cheese? Why would you do that? Why not just drink the milk? How much milk can you drink? I mean, I'm just a little curious. If you've got a whole puddle of milk, it's going to spoil before you drink it, right? If you've got a whole bucket full of milk. So the best way to preserve it is to make it into cheese. There you go. Is that what you said? You were right. That's it. So now, of course, now those really rich guys that were controlling the society, and not allowing people to eat. Now it's a more equal, egalitarian society. So everybody gets a lot of dairy products. Everybody gets a lot of meat. What do they manufacture besides cheese in Holland? Canned meats. A lot of canned hams. So canned hams come out of Holland. Anyway, they eat a lot of meat and they eat a lot of cheese. And there you go. That's one of the reasons why the Dutch are so damn tall. In the late 19th century, on average, Americans were among the tallest in the world, reflecting their relative advantage in income. The gross national product per capita was third highest in the world. One of the things that happened in the 19th century, we just had on November 11th, we had the anniversary of the armistice in World War I. It was 100 years ago. 100 years ago, the World War I ended. One of the things that was happening before World War I, at the end of the 19th century, before the war, one of the things that was happening was that most of the countries in Europe were controlled by a monarchy. So there was a Kaiser, the Kaiser ran Germany, and there was a king that, well, not really a king that ran France. There was a king in France, but he wasn't really running anything. But there was a queen of England. A queen at the end of the 19th century was Queen Victoria. And then it became King George, I think, George one of the Georges. But there were monarchies that were controlling all the governments. And since they were monarchies, they had this hierarchy, they had this caste system. And if you were one of the poor people, which was about 50% of the population, maybe up to 75% of the population, you really didn't eat very well. So that's what was going on in the 19th century. But in the United States, of course, we had equality to whatever extent we had equality. So if you lived in the United States, anybody could have milk. Anybody could eat meat. But if you lived in Poland, until the end of World War I, if you were a peasant that lived in Poland, you got meat on Christmas Day and then you got meat on Easter, and that was it. The rest of the time you ate potatoes, or you ate whatever you could find out in the woods, which usually wasn't any meat, because all the meat belonged to the king.
Deer meat.
Deer meat, sure, it was there, but that belonged to the king. And if you killed a deer and butchered that deer, and you got caught, then you were put in prison.
A rabbit?
Rabbits belonged to the king as well.
Jeez.
I know, everything did. You could eat the mice if you were that hungry, or rats, but there weren't very many to be had, and that was part of the problem. Anyways, but if you lived in the United States and you shot a deer, you could go ahead and eat the damn thing. But in Europe, you couldn't, because all of the monarchs owned all of the empty forests belonged to the monarchs, and everything in the forest belonged to the monarch as well. So we had the third highest gross national product per capita in the world. At the time, American men stood 1 inch taller than Brits, who had the highest gross national product in the world. The same height as Australians. Australians were pretty much like Americans, so they were pretty free, relatively free as compared to other people in the world. 2 inches taller than Norwegians, who had a king. 3 inches taller than the French, who lived in a different type of society. 4 inches taller than Italians, who had a king as well. And more than 7 inches taller than the Japanese, who are not very tall people, who are genetically not very tall people. When I lived in Japan, I was about the same height as most of the Japanese guys. But we had different shaped legs. I think I've told you this before. The Japanese are banty-legged. In other words, their thighs are short and their calves are long. So they can sit on their heels, which is something I can't do. I was a catcher for an extended length of time. It seemed like, put the ugly short kid as the catcher. If he catches a foul tip in the schnoz, nobody will care. Okay. So I was a catcher for a long time. I was a good catcher too. Had a pretty good arm towards second base. Okay, anyway. 7 inches taller than the Japanese. Interesting, South Korean children are about 5 inches taller than their North Korean counterparts. And of course, they've been in famine for, what, 15 years or something? The North Koreans. And this is one of the reasons why the North Koreans want us to leave them alone. Because one of the things we won't let them have is food. We have put sanctions on them because they're so, they're doing such, they're putting together nuclear weapons and whatnot. And we don't want them to do that. And so we don't allow them to get food. The Japanese immigrants in California in the 1950s were about 5 inches taller than their counterparts in Japan. So in the United States, where they got dairy food, dairy products, and they were able to eat meat, they grew 5 inches taller than their exactly the same genetic structure in a different place. Dairy consumption in particular has been linked to height. And of course, most Japanese are lactose intolerant. But they can drink milk as children. Of course, they drink mother's milk right after birth. So they were getting milk until they became an adolescent, till they went through puberty. Japanese and Korean adults report sleeping about an hour less per day than French adults do. Moreover, these cultural differences are not just evident among adults. A systematic study of infants and toddlers in 17 countries around the world found that the Japanese infants sleep about 1.5 hours less than North American infants. Okay, so the Japanese don't sleep as long as we do in the United States. Really? Does that make a difference? Sure, that's when you grow. That's when you do all your growing. Infants from Asian countries were found to sleep much less than infants from Western countries. Dutch infants were found to sleep about 1.3 hours longer than American infants, which means they sleep a lot less than the Japanese, about 3 hours more. I'm sorry, the Dutch sleep 3 hours more than the Japanese. I know, that's huge. People in countries at the extreme of the sleep spectrum, Japan and the Netherlands, have a pronounced difference in the amount of sleep, the amount that they sleep. And this is one of the reasons why we see the Japanese sleeping at their desks. We see them sleeping on the subways. We never see that in France. You never see anybody sleeping in France. On the subway anyway, they sleep during time. But they don't sleep in the subway. I know, this is a funny picture. Japanese, European Canadians, and Asian Canadians were provided biometric measurements to measure their sleep. Japanese participants slept about 1.2 hours less than the two Canadian samples, whether they were Asian Canadians or European Canadians. Asian Canadians slept similarly to European Canadians, showing that it is cultural. It's a cultural thing, and that's one of the reasons why this guy's making fun of the two Japanese ladies sitting beside him. He's acting like he put them to sleep. He's a Canadian, by the way. Canadians are such jokers, aren't they? Has anybody ever seen a Canadian comedy? Hardly. Yeah, they're not funny. It's not funny, is it? Canadian comedy? You thought it was funny? Red Green? Yeah, the Cree guy. Oh, yeah. Oh,
Native comedy.
Oh, native. All native comedies. Have you ever seen a European Canadian comedy show? They don't even make them up there. They're not funny at all. But what's that guy? The one that makes all the faces. Rich Little was Canadian. The guy that was married to the Playboy Bunny. What is his name? He's been in a bunch of movies. I can't even think of his name. There's a lot of Canadian comedians, but they have to come down here to be funny. I don't know. They can't be funny up there, I guess. John, wait a minute, the fat guy who died of a heart attack. He was in a bunch
John Candy?
I'm sorry?
John Candy?
John Candy, yeah. He was Canadian. There's a bunch of Canadian comedians, but they're not funny up in Canada. Japanese participants indicated that their ideal amount of sleep was about an hour less than that reported by Canadians. The Canadians described themselves as feeling more tired during the day, even though they were sleeping more than the Japanese. What do we know about the Canadians? Well, it's farther north, so it's darker in the wintertime. Until recently, socioeconomic status was invisible to health researchers. We didn't even think about it. We just called people Americans, we called people the Dutch, we called people whatever. But we didn't even look at their socioeconomic status. As if money is a taboo topic that we can't talk about. We like to pretend that everybody in the United States is exactly the same. But the reality is, you guys get IHS. You have IHS. It may be a crap health care system, but at least it's a health care system. What about other people, other minorities that live in the United States? Does anybody else have free health care? Or just you guys? Does anybody else get free health care in the United States?
Prisoners.
People in prisons, there you go. So if I want good health care, I need to, commit a crime. Okay. Good to know, okay. Did you get that? Commit a crime. Well, you don't have to worry about it. You've got AHS. That's not fair. As a white guy, I've got to commit a crime in order to get good health care. Okay. So what was wrong with Obamacare? What's wrong with the Affordable Care Act? I mean, it insured like millions more, 18 million more people or something. And we're almost ready to go to war because the Republicans voted 57 times to get rid of it. John McCain saved Obamacare. John McCain. I know. So what's wrong with Obamacare?
Does that make businesses
I'm
pay
sorry?
more toward healthcare?
No, it makes them pay less. Some people can get insurance they couldn't get before, especially if they had a pre-existing condition. That was a big deal. That's one of the things that pissed people off the most. Some people just hate it.
So it raised taxes?
Not yet. Hasn't raised taxes yet. Doesn't raise taxes until 2025 or something.
It costs the rich people?
I'm sorry?
It costs the rich people?
Yeah.
Because of the
cost-
biasness?
I'm sorry?
Biasness?
They are biased, yeah.
Biasness? Because of the president?
He hates it. He despises it.
Basically, he just really downgrades Obama for everything. Start.
Must be something wrong with that Obama guy. Evidently, Trump hates him. Trump's a wonderful person. You guys shouldn't worry about this because you got IHS, so you don't have to worry about
As
Obamacare.
long as we live in the red.
As long as you live as long as you live close enough to an IHS hospital. So you could go, I mean, if you lived in Phoenix, isn't there IHS in Phoenix?
Yeah.
Sure. In Tucson?
I don't know.
Albuquerque?
No.
No?
In Santa Fe, I think. Yeah, Santa Fe.
Santa Fe.
Vegas.
Like military guys, we have to live close enough to an Air Force base or an Army post so that we can go buy cheap food at the commissary.
You
Yeah.
think it's cheap? I think it's overpriced.
So you guys need to think about being Indians and being close enough to a reservation so that you can get good health care, or at least health care. Otherwise, you're gonna have to pay for it. Otherwise, you're gonna have to go into Obamacare.
So what's wrong with it? Are you gonna talk about it? Oh.
I'm a Democrat, so
Okay.
I don't see anything wrong with it at all.
Good.
But there's a reason why I'm mentioning this. The reason I'm mentioning this is because they did studies looking at socioeconomic status. And what they determined was socioeconomic status was more important than smoking. It made a difference in how long you were going to live. And more of a difference than if you smoked or didn't smoke. So the amount of money that you make, and I've got some statistics that'll just knock your ears off, or your eyes out. I don't know, it's gonna knock something out. Be careful what falls off. Research in 1984 of English civil servants were divided into 4 class categories. The researchers found that compared with top administrators, that's the first type of, the first category. Top administrators, members of the executive class, that's the second one, they were 60% more likely to die over a 10-year period. So if you were a top executive, if you were in charge, and the people that were right directly under you, the people that were directly under you had a 60% higher death rate than you did. So if you were in charge, if you were a monarch, if you were the CEO, if you were Donald Trump, then you had the people that worked for you, the people that were right directly under you, they had a 60% chance of dying before you did. It gets worse. The clerical staff, the people that took care of the executive class, they had a 120% more likely, they were 120% more likely to die. Now this is in England, of course, but wait until we see the United States. The unskilled labor is 170% more likely to die. So your socioeconomic status is very important. More important than smoking, as it turns out. They're coming for us. Despite the fact that these are very large differences, they have been replicated in many industrialized countries. It's not just England. We looked at all these other countries and we found exactly the same thing. And this is one of the reasons why Obamacare was so important. It was going to help the people that were underinsured at the bottom of the pile. So we've got welfare, and then we've got the employer. But we had like millions and millions of people that were in between welfare. They couldn't afford welfare because they made too much money and weren't really getting very good health care from their employers. So there were millions and millions of these people. So they decided that they would pass Obamacare. And this is when the Democrats controlled both houses of Congress, right after Obama was elected president. And so they developed Obamacare. And they added 18 million people to the insured list in the United States. That was the good thing about Obamacare. It added all these people. The idea was that Obamacare would pay for itself. And the way that it would pay for itself was because since there were so many more people that were being insured, that they could, that the insurance companies would lower the premiums, would start lowering the premiums naturally, because they had all of these other people that were paying them more money. And the only time you lose money for health care is when somebody gets sick. As long as people stayed healthy, you were okay. And one of the rules in Obamacare was that you had to come in for whatever that is. Okay. You had to come in for an appointment at least once a year. So they could just look at you and find out if there's anything wrong with you. If you don't have insurance, one of the things that happens is if you get sick, you try to stay away from the hospital because you have to pay out through the nose for it. I know. But you guys don't have to worry about that. Anytime you guys get sick, you just go to IHS. And it may be crap health care, but at least it's health care. I mean, it's better than nothing, right? And so a lot of these individuals, they weren't going into the hospital until they were almost dead. And at that point, of course, they had to be hospitalized. Maybe they had cancer that was untreatable now because they waited so long and the cancer had advanced to a point where they could barely function. So it was really costing us a lot more money. So Obamacare was a good thing. It actually increased the health care in the United States, but people wouldn't buy into it. And most of the people that wouldn't buy into it were the Republicans who complained about it from the very beginning until John McCain went, no, I will not support destroying Obamacare. It was John McCain's the hero of the world of the United States. And he was your U.S. Senator now, of course, he's the late John McCain, but he's the hero. He was the one that did it. And all those jerk Republicans that voted to do away with Obamacare, they had nothing to replace it with. They weren't going to replace it with anything. In this last election, a huge portion of the reasons that people voted for the Democrats is because the Republicans wanted to do away with all of these aspects of Obamacare. And that's good for somebody that's already got insurance. What do they care what we do with people that don't have enough money? But the Democrats, they said, no, we're not going to get rid of pre-existing conditions. Pre-existing conditions are huge. Before 2008, if I got insurance, if I started working here and I had a child that had multiple sclerosis, no, MS, not MS, what do I want to give him? Cystic fibrosis. Let's give him cystic fibrosis. And I signed on for the insurance. I couldn't get insurance for my kid. I'd have to pay for my child because they wouldn't accept pre-existing conditions. So he wouldn't count. If I had a child with type 1 diabetes, I wouldn't be able to get insurance on it. But with Obamacare, pre-existing conditions, they can't disqualify pre-existing conditions. So when I start working someplace, they take care of all my children. They have insurance for all my kids. I don't have to throw one kid out or two kids out, which is what had to happen before. I know that sounds horrible, and of course you guys don't have to worry about it, but I mean, if you were non-native, then you were SOL. That was before 2008. So now the last election was about pre-existing conditions. And that's why the Democrats just kicked butt as far as the House was concerned. You know, every congressman had to be re-elected. The 435 people in the House of Representatives had to be re-elected. And the Democrats flipped it. They were behind, they had less than 200 people, 200 representatives, and now they have 232, I think. And we're not done yet. There are still some elections that are going. So what I'm saying is this is really important stuff. And socioeconomic status means a huge amount to how long you're going to live. Okay, what are we talking? Despite the fact that these are very large differences, they have been replicated in many industrialized countries. In Denmark, for example, this is the Brits. So we looked at the Brits first and we discovered this, but the same thing is true in Denmark. The same thing is true in Norway. The same thing is true in Finland. The same thing is true in France. And, I'm showing all policemen because they were looking at civil servants. The same thing is true in Japan. So the more money you have in Japan, the longer you're going to live, the higher your socioeconomic status. The same thing was true in New Zealand. So they've done studies in all these different countries and they found exactly the same thing. In the United States, almost every increase in income reduces the mortality rates, and these differences emerge even among those incomes at the highest level. Now this is really kind of interesting, because if we're talking about Donald Trump, we're talking about somebody with $7 billion. At least that's what he claims. We don't know how much money the guy has, because he won't give us his tax return. And I don't know if you care about his tax returns, but I'm kind of curious as to how much money this guy actually has. So if you're a billionaire, if you're Bill Gates, you're going to live forever. If you're Warren Buffett, who is the second richest guy in the United States, or Jeff Bezos, who owns Amazon, yeah, Jeff Bezos, with $38 billion, or whatever $1 billion he has, they're going to live for a really, really long time. They can afford anything. Potentially. They're billionaires. They can afford anything. So what happens when we compare them with millionaires? Somebody with only a couple $100 million. Who's going to live the longest? Bill Gates or Sharon with $200 million? Who's going to live the longest? Well, she's got an advantage because she's female. Females live longer than males.
And then she probably has a good family.
And if she gives all of her money away, then she's going to be good. Okay. No, she probably won't live as long as Bill Gates, because Bill Gates has more of an income. This is weird. This gets really weird. And this is what it looks like. This is in the United States. Death rates rise as incomes fall, and that's 2 different years. This is the red one is 1992, and the second one is 2010. Yeah, as you can see, the more money, the higher your income, the lower your death rate. The lower your income, the higher your death rate. And as you can see, it is a
It's everybody
curve.
in the United States.
This is the United States. I'm sorry?
I said this is everybody in the United States.
Yeah.
The numbers would be different if it was here.
Well, reservations, you guys don't, we can't really factor you into this because you have free health care and everybody else in the United States has to pay for their health care. So, except for military. But we can factor, actually we can factor them in, but we can't factor you guys in because of the fact that you get free health care, which is not a bad deal. Probably the smartest thing you guys ever put in the treaties was healthcare. Good job. Smart. Okay, so we looked at a different group. This is Burkina Faso. It's a country in West Africa. They looked at 3 different groups: the Fulani, the Mosi, and the Remabi. The region is endemic with malaria. This is sub-Saharan Africa. This is the rainforest down here. Malaria all over West Africa. The biggest problem that they have. The Mosi and the Remabi have been living in this region for thousands of years and have developed a genetic resistance to malaria over time. And one of the ways they did that was by developing sickle cell. If you have the sickle cell trait, then you will not get malaria. If you have the sickle cell anemia, of course you'll die of sickle cell, but you won't get malaria. But of course, if you're that one kid that doesn't have the trait, or have sickle cell, then you'll die of malaria. Okay. But that's what's going on with the Mosi and the Remabi. The Fulani moved into the region in the early 19th century as part of the Islamic invasion of sub-Saharan Africa. The Fulani have not developed much genetic resistance to malaria. They don't have the sickle cell trait. The Fulani are the dominant ethnic group in the area, so they're in charge. And the reason they're in charge is because when they came into the area, they conquered everybody, and they enslaved everybody. They took away their culture. They took away the Mosi culture, and they took away the Remabi culture. So they don't have a culture. It's gone. It was destroyed by the Fulani. The higher the status they have as conquerors appears to provide them with enough health benefits to more than make up for the genetic vulnerability to malaria. So they don't die any faster than anybody else, despite the fact that they don't have any natural immunity to malaria, like the Mosi and the Remabi. So just the fact that they are in charge gives them an immunity to things. They live as long as anybody else does because they're in charge. And this is one of the things, of course, we notice in the military. If you look at people that are officers, they live a lot longer than the enlisted personnel. And the sergeants live longer than the lower ranking individuals. And in combat, of course, who gets to tell people what to do? Well, the officers tell the NCOs tell the enlisted personnel, and the enlisted personnel do the fighting. Of course, the sergeants are there as well, but it has to do with who gets PTSD. The lower ranking people get PTSD. The higher ranking individuals don't develop PTSD because they're in charge. Your health may be seriously compromised if you don't have enough money to pay for adequate health care. That's one of the reasons. In the British civil servant study, however, they all had exactly the same. They all had exactly the same health care. So that's not really it. It's not the fact that some people have health care and other people don't. It's not because somebody's health care is better than somebody else's. It's the fact it has to do with money. It has everything to do with money, as bizarre as that may seem. People lower in socioeconomic status are more likely to have jobs that place them in hazardous situations, such as having to deal with poisonous toxins, or that make them vulnerable to workplace accidents like working in like mining. When there were so many Navajos that were mining uranium, It's a very, very dangerous job. The probability, I mean, you're going into a mountain, right? So the probability that the mountain's going to fall in on you is not that remote. It's very possible. So it's a very dangerous job. People in the lower socioeconomic status groups are more likely to smoke, to eat a poor diet, and are less likely to exercise. I love this picture. I know. It's so true, isn't it? Look how fat she is. I'm sorry. Obese. Did I say fat? I did. Obese. Okay. I think I'm related to her. I think she's my sister-in-law. Chronically stressed people are more likely to engage in health-compromising behaviors such as smoking and drinking in order to cope with the difficulties in their lives, and stress directly weakens the immune system's ability to fight off infections and manage other threats. So if you get stressed out, guess what's going to happen next? You probably catch a cold. I know it's not right. My sister, I know, my poor sister, her husband told her that he wanted to be a lady. He wanted to be a female. He thought of himself as a limp woman on the inside. And it was so distressing to her that she developed all kinds of interesting problems. She developed cancer. She developed a toxic heart. She had cardiomyopathy. She was fine before, but she became stressed out because this guy told her that he didn't want to be a guy anymore. And it bothered her so much that she developed all these problems because of the stress. Her immune system broke down, and she developed cancer. We're all fighting cancer right now. Some of you are way too young to be developing cancer. But I'm so old, my immune system is fighting cancer on a continual basis. That's what happens as you get older. Your immune system gets weaker, and because your body has to reproduce all of these cells, I'm more likely to develop a cancer. It's one of the reasons why you don't see that many kids with cancer. You do see kids with cancer, but it's not very many. And every time you do, it's a tragedy. But when you see an old fart with cancer, does that bother you? No, they develop cancer all the time. Their immune systems are weaker. They're immunocompromised. So it's not that big a deal if a 70-year-old gets cancer. But it is a big deal if a 5-year-old gets cancer. I used to work in a pediatrics hospital. Boy, that was a tragedy. Looking at all those kids with leukemia and whatnot. But there weren't that many. And now, of course, we can cure leukemia. People who feel that they do not have much control in their jobs tend to have a higher risk of heart disease. I taught at this place for 10 years. And then I did research. I couldn't get anybody to agree that I should do my research. And they fired me. I'd been working there for 10 years. I was taking care of 2 programs, not one. 2. I was teaching all the psychology classes and all the human service classes. I was doing a double load every semester. I was busting my tail. I never got sick. I never, ever got sick. But then they fired me. They fired me because I did something they didn't like. I thought I was immune to that, but I wasn't. And the next thing that happened, I had a heart attack. I know, it was like 9 days after they fired me, I had a heart attack. As long as I was in charge, and I was pretty much in charge of the psychology program and the human service program, I was fine. But as soon as they fired me, as soon as I wasn't in control anymore, I had a heart attack. Low levels of control are more generally associated with poor physical functioning and an increased likelihood of illness. And this is one of the things that you need to watch out for. If you get a job and you've got a boss that just will not get off your butt, get off your back, wherever your boss is, that bastard, get him off there. Or her, yeah, exactly. Get off. Then there's a large possibility that you're going to get sick. that you're going to catch more colds. When the flu comes around, you're going to catch it. So one of the things you have to do is not let this guy give you a hard time. You need to be in control. Otherwise, you're going to get sick. I mean, if you've got a real jerk for a boss, then you probably need to find another job. Or tell him to get off your back. You're a pain in my neck. Get off my back. One study by Lockman and Weaver in 1998 found that although lower socioeconomic status people have worse health outcomes, those with lower socioeconomic status who felt that they had much control in their lives had levels of health and well-being that were comparable with those in higher income groups. What does that tell you? You need to feel like you can control your own destiny. If you feel like somebody else is controlling you, you're going to get sick. The stress is going to get to you. So all you have to do is feel like you have control. Do whatever you can. Steal a pen, I don't care. Do something to make you feel like you're in charge, like you have control over your own destiny. That's one of the things that's happening right now, is that we have less control than we did last year. And so what I'm doing is I'm not paying attention to all of this harassment that's going on. I'm trying to pretend that it's not going to happen, that it's not happening. Otherwise, I'll get sick. Well, that's not good. I don't want to get sick. I'm trying to, poor Tiffany needs 202, Psych 202. It's been a battle. We've been fighting all semester to get that class approved. But we can't get it past some of the people in the administration. But it's going to happen. You got both Sarah and I are fighting this thing. So, and it's not that big a deal. It's only like 0.4.
And then of course there's Tara.
Yeah, Tara's there as well. Yeah, sure. But we would be teaching the class. One of us would be teaching the class. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. Or I'll quit. I don't want to get sick. I figure if I threaten to quit, maybe they'll change their minds. That's a last ditch effort, me quitting.
Don't do that.
Yeah, I don't want to quit.
Do you ever plan on leaving though?
My wife is planning on me leaving, but I have no plans. So we'll see what happens.
So you don't plan on leaving anytime soon?
I will. My wife thinks I'm going to stay until I'm 70, and I'm going to stay until she forces me to leave.
How old are you now? You just said
I'm
you were
69.
70.
Oh
You're gonna be
my
like, listen
gosh.
around with
So I will definitely be here next year. Okay. So I mean, I can only go.
Bruce, the only way I think we know that you're gonna leave is your wood pile goes down.
I've got so much wood. I have like 3 years worth of wood.
It's gonna stay for another 2 years.
But I'll be here until my wife forces me to leave.
You've been bringing sometimes
Has
you
she
say,
tried?
tell me
I'm sorry?
Has she tried? Has she tried?
Yeah, she told me the last time I saw her that, you got to retire pretty soon. And I said, no, I'm doing okay. I'm doing fine. That's what I told her. I can still walk up the stairs. Yeah, I mean, how many people can walk up the stairs? Travis? just me. Okay. So I'm in good shape. We'll see what happens. We'll see what happens as far as my wife is concerned. She has a way to, I won't do it, of convincing me that I need to do something. Wise, I swear. Okay, so let's kill people. This is not just true of humans. Research has been with various primates has revealed that those individuals who are subordinate in a hierarchy and experience have greater stress hormone levels when the society is ruled by intimidation. And what's going on in the United States right now? I know, if you watch the news, and if this bothers you, don't watch the news. What did Trump say yesterday? Presidential harassment. He's starting to call the news people for presidential harassment. He's kind of a bully. I don't know if you noticed that or not. At least he is to me, since I'm not a Republican. Maybe that's why I'm bullied by him, or what he says bothers me. But he seems to be trying to rule by intimidation. He threatens people. We already know that when people attack him, he attacks 10 times stronger. That's what he says anyway. And that's one of the reasons why he's said so many dumb things. I mean, what did he call himself the other day? A nationalist? We've already talked about nationalists. That's Nazism, okay? And the French, when he was over in France for Armistice Day, the French president said, "We do not recognize that term. That is a negative term. We don't use it in France." There were 2 Brits that were just arrested and thrown in jail for having a Nazi flag. It's against the law in England to have a Nazi flag and to call yourself a nationalist. Not in the United States. I mean, we've got a president that claims to be a nationalist. What's that all about? Intimidation, right? Right, Sharon? Come on, intimidation. Do I intimidate you? Because I'm so big? No, I don't intimidate anybody. Okay, the high stress hormones are especially true when subordinate primates are unable to easily avoid dominant individuals and when they have low availability of social support. And of course, this is one of the things that was happening at Fort Belknap. They were trying to get rid of all the non-native faculty members. And of course, I'd been there for 10 years, another one had been there for 18 years, and they were harassing us. They were picking on us. They were doing all kinds of interesting things. Mostly I just ignored it. But eventually, of course, they fired me. They finally got me in a position where they could get me fired, or where they had an excuse to fire me. So that they were picking on me. They were trying to intimidate me to get me to quit. The societal features that result in the greatest degree of stress among subordinates in various primate populations are remarkably similar to the situation in which many low socioeconomic status people find themselves in modernized, industrialized societies. People are intimidated. They don't get very good education. The schools aren't as good. If I'm competing with somebody, I went to Wabash, they went to Harvard, who gets the job? Me or the person that went to Harvard? And the answer is the guy that goes to Harvard. So they take care of their own. Wealthy people do. People of higher socioeconomic status. If you want to be successful, go to Harvard, go to Yale, go to Dartmouth, go to wherever. Go to an Eastern school. If you can stand the people, they're kind of different. They're real different. Okay. And it's cold over there. It's cold and humid. Now, this is the bizarre part. When people compare themselves to other people, I don't compare myself with somebody, a homeless person in Albuquerque. Why wouldn't in the world, I'm not at that level. They're at a lower socioeconomic status. They're at the lowest socioeconomic status. Do I feel really good because I see homeless people in Albuquerque? The answer is no. I compare myself with other people at my level. That's the way it works. This gets really interesting. Feeling poor can matter as much as actually being poor. The experience of relative deprivation of knowing that others are doing better than you might lead to stress and its associated negative health consequences. One of the things we see in the Trump administration, I hate to pick on the president all the time, but it's really kind of obvious. All the people in his administration are other billionaires. And when they did the tax cut, who did the tax cut help? Billionaires. It helped the corporations and the billionaires. It helped really wealthy people. It really cut their taxes. It cut our taxes as well, but very little. My taxes weren't cut at all because I'm middle class. And middle class people didn't really get their taxes cut. A very minuscule amount. And because my wife is retired, I didn't get any tax cut at all, as it turns out. But this is really kind of weird. So when you've got Sharon with her $200 million, And you've got Travis with $300 million. Does she compare herself with me? I make $60,000 a year. Does she compare herself with me? No, she compares herself with Travis. And so she feels poor because Travis has $300 million and she's only got $200 million. And so she looks at the kind of car that he drives. Of course, he drives a Ferrari and she only drives a Maserati. So his car costs $350,000 and hers only costs $250,000. So which one of them is worse off? Obviously the Maserati driver, not the Ferrari driver, my goodness gracious. So she feels bad. And this will hurt her immune system. This will bother her immune system. I went to college, I went to Wabash. Wabash is a relatively elite school in Indiana. It's a pre-med school. So like half of the people in my graduating class became doctors. Well, the odd thing is, a lot of these guys are dead. A lot of the people that I went to college with, well, I'm old, for one thing. But that's not really the reason why. So a lot of these guys became doctors and they became millionaires. But the surgeons did better than the GPs, the general practitioners. I know. The dermatologists didn't do nearly as well as the surgeons did. So we had one guy that was a NASA doctor. And afterwards, he's a multi-millionaire. He's got millions and millions of dollars. So a lot of these doctors, when they compare themselves with other people that they graduated with, they died. They died because they felt so bad about who they were and the fact that they weren't making more money. So what you have to do is not compare yourself with anybody else. Just assume that you're on top of the heap because, well, this is my hill right here. Okay, there we go. And I'm not going to compare myself with any of those other rich people. But they did. They did, and these people have died. Lawyers, same way. They've died. Because they were criminal lawyers, or they were whatever. They were corporate lawyers, and they weren't making as much money as somebody else. So they died. As sad as that is. I went to school with 25 African Americans were in my class. 25 African Americans. This gets kind of weird. We're going to talk about this in a second. 25 African Americans were coming. Oh, I got 8. 2 of them are still alive. The rest of them are dead. They've died. Some of them died relatively young. So wait a minute. So these were African Americans. They could afford to go to Wabash, which was relatively expensive. Yet almost all of them are dead. Why is that? I'm not dead. We were in the same dormitory together. They had better jobs than I did. So why did they die? Well, we're going to find out in just a second. Now this is a tragedy. This is really a tragedy. There's a clear relation between the absolute wealth of a nation and the average life expectancy of its citizens. This is true up to a gross domestic product per capita figure of approximately $30,000 per year. And as you can see, where are we? We're here. We're 48,442. So anything over $30,000, it evens out after $30,000. Below $30,000, now we got a problem. Above the per capita gross domestic product, $30,000, the curve largely flattens out, suggesting very little relation between absolute wealth and life expectancy. Many of the countries in the flat part of the curve have average incomes that are lower than that of the lowest Americans, yet these people don't seem to be worse off in terms of health outcomes, and there's a reason for that. Poor Americans are doing far worse than wealthier Americans. Income and wealth is actually a relationship between health and one's income relative to those around us. We don't compare ourselves, I don't compare myself with the homeless in Albuquerque, even though I saw them on television last night. They put them in, don't worry, they put them in shelters last night because it was so cold in Albuquerque last night. So they had to put them in shelters, but they're okay, they're fine. But I don't compare myself with those guys. So who would I compare myself with? Well, I compare myself with a professor from New Mexico, University of New Mexico, or somebody from ASU, or somebody from Arizona. Now, I shouldn't really do that because I'm making a lot less money than all those guys. I'm from Muncie, Indiana. Muncie, Indiana has Ball State University. Ball State University is a state university, yet somebody with my level of education is making $120,000. That's twice as much money as I make. And that's in my hometown.
Why are you here?
What the hell am I doing there? Am I the dumbest person in the world? I'm here to have a good time, okay? Obviously, it's working.
Yeah.
Should I go after the bucks?
If you go after the bucks, it'll cause more stress on you.
It will. It'll cause more stress, and I'll probably be dead within a year. So I'm happy. I'm perfectly happy.
So you're saying
What?
we should play it safe and just stop at the bachelor's. That's it.
Well, if that's who
Going forward.
if that's who you're comparing yourself with, I mean, one of the things that you have to look at is how much education do all the other people around me have. So if a bachelor's degree is a big deal on the reservation, then yeah, stop at a bachelor's degree.
If you want to live longer.
If you want to live longer. And don't be competitive. Don't be hyper competitive. It's hostility that kills people. That's what causes all the stress that kills you, is the fact that you're angry with this person because they're making more money than you. So a lot of places don't tell you how much money everybody else is making. They make a deal with you, and then you're not allowed to talk about how much money you're making. This is what happened when I was at my last college, at Ashford University. If you mentioned your wages, how much money you were making, they would fire you. Because then other people would find out that you're making more money than them, and they get pissed off, and they would ask for a raise, and they didn't want to give anybody a raise. It gets really weird. And all this has to do with either being an instructor, an assistant professor, an associate professor, or a professor. And right now they've just started doing the whole rank structure at this institution. So it's going to get really weird. Some people are going to be professors that simply shouldn't be. Some people are not going to be professors who probably should be. And it's going to cause a lot of heartache for people. So we'll see what happens. I didn't apply. It's going to be a raise, but I don't care about money. If I cared about money, I wouldn't have so much wood. I have like 15
You know what's
loads of wood.
causing me stress?
What? That's so sad. You know what we should do about that? Nothing. You're going to have to write the paper anyway. Indians living in the poor province of Kerala have far lower absolute incomes than poor African Americans in the United States. However, people in Kerala outlive African Americans by a substantial degree. The Keralians are poor in absolute terms, but they likely feel less poor because nearly everyone around them is poor. So if I compared myself with the homeless of Albuquerque, I'd feel pretty damn good because I've got a lot more money than they do. I've got food in my refrigerator. I've got wood. I've got 15 loads of wood. I'm going to stay warm this winter. And those guys, they had to just pull them off the street and put them in a shelter in order to keep them warm. And I got all that wood.
You
So
don't
I
go
should.
home for the winter?
I'm sorry?
You don't go home for the winter?
I'm going to go home for Christmas, but we don't have a stove at my house. So I have to, burn, I don't know what I'm burning, something, diesel or something, diesel fuel. Anyway, okay, I guess it's time to stop, isn't it? I'll explain the African Americans on Thursday.